Welcome to this episode of Reaching Minds, Thoughts for Your Life Journey. In today's podcast, we will be exploring what happens when leaders overuse their strengths and how their personality and persona shape that dynamic. And more importantly, what impact this can have on themselves and on others. Joining me today is my very good colleague, Joseph Ogbonna. Joseph is a leadership and executive coach with the ICF and an FRSA. He treasures wisdom and has expertise in mind-shifting strategic thinking. Joseph also has special interest in African affairs and the movement of our bodies. Welcome, Joseph. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Nita, for having me here again.
This is the third time, Joseph.
I know. This is for having me again. Yes. So thank you. Yes, it's good to be with you and support what you are giving out to the world.
Thank you, Joseph. Let's kick off. In my beginning, I spoke about looking at strengths. So what do we mean by strengths, Joseph?
One of the books that popularized the concept of strengths in many management circles is Discover Your Strengths by Marcus Buckingham and Dave Clifton, where they highlighted that in their interviews of, I believe it's about 10,000 very successful people across the world, they highlighted that people who excel by knowing what their strengths are, polishing and nurturing them, and keeping them in focus, rather than spending their time trying to be rounded and balanced, therefore focusing on their weaknesses, trying to make their weaknesses strengths. And when I think of strengths in that context, I think of it that the things that you're born with, but also environment has helped to shape so that you rely on them more. And that was until a short while ago. Now, I studied psychology as a first degree and have always had an interest in psychology. But recently, I did some personality assessment training, and both the Luminous Spark and the Hogan highlighted something that in the personality that we have, there are strengths. That who we are in our personality is a strength in itself. And so that gives a slightly different perspective, which is, it's not something you learn, but something you are.
Can you give us an example of that, Joseph?
Yes. With a strength, the Marcus Buckingham scenario, something like responsiveness, being able to respond to signals immediately. The phone rings, you pick it up. Like you can imagine in a contact center, the individual who is always on the ball responds very quickly. That is a strength that they have. And they'll respond to people and use that all the time. Now, with the personality one, it would be something like extroversion. As somebody who gets their energy from being with people, who thinks outward. So they're in their speaking, they're thinking. Those are, I hope, two different ones. One is a way of acting, and the other one is a way of being, which also shows up in the acting and how people are.
You're saying is that the personality aspect of it is innate and something that you're born with. In the extroversion, you don't learn it, you're born with it.
Do you know what? The debate is still out as far as I'm concerned, because there is research that shows that personality is still being formed as we grow up. So that at up to 17, for example, that someone's personality is being formed, which suggests that it is what you're born with plus your environment. If you look at it that personality, what you're born with might be the preference you have.
Yes.
The preference you have for acting. But as time goes on, you might learn different ways of acting outside your preference. And for many of our listeners who will be leaders, you will have the experience of knowing what you prefer, but what you then do might be slightly different.
So there's a kind of flexibility. There's a kind of, you step aside from your preference. I like that word, that there's a preference for me to be an introvert. However, in certain context, I know that how I need to show up is more as an extrovert.
Absolutely. And that comes with experience, some of it with learning, purposeful learning and intention, and others just from things you're exposed to. If you are reinforced by an environment, you tend to do those things even more. And the things that you are dissuaded from doing, you are punished for doing, you tend to do less of, because what's the point?
Now, one of the things we also said at the beginning is how maybe we end up overusing our strengths or our preferences. What might be the kind of consequences of that, do you think? Where actually your strength might become a shadow part of you.
Yes, this is something I became fascinated. Yeah, became very interested in as I did this personality assessment training, is that the concept of overusing our strengths, because as we are encouraged to use our strengths, to lean more on our strengths, to polish them, to take care of them, so that we can either find ways of managing our weaknesses or find people who manage our weaknesses for us. But then the concept that strength you have can be overused was fascinating for me. And an example of that is, let's say I'm an extrovert and a good communicator. I like being with people. And I speak out, people know where I stand with things. In a particular context, when I am stressed, I can very easily begin to talk a lot and to talk very quickly, relying on that, wanting to convince people. But what's required there might be for me to keep quiet and let my team speak up and take the space and empower people. But because I'm stressed, I'm worried about what might happen, I begin to rely on what has worked for me, but to the exclusion of everything else.
So it becomes more of a hindrance as opposed to getting what you want.
Yes, you might get what you want as an individual, but you might damage everybody else in the process.
In the process.
And in which case, what then happens?
I guess people shut up and don't say anything. They don't feel there's a space or time for them to contribute.
And in a world today where that is complex and fast moving, it is very unlikely that any one leader knows everything that's going on. You need the people around you to not just be aware of what's going to them, but feeding in information into decisions so that it's relevant to what is going on. So for leaders, this concept of being aware of when you derail, when your strengths are overused, you are overextended. And what are the circumstances, recognizing it and being able to, knowing how to manage it is really important.
And it makes me think about that certain persona individuals have in leadership, and maybe they're the fixer or the strong one. How do you see persona shaping a leader's behavior over time?
The distinction I make between personality and persona is that the personality is, yes, who we are, our behaviors and our ways of thinking. And the persona is the outer shell of that. And sometimes we can construct that either from experience or from training. We can construct the personality that I show up at meetings as a bold person. That may not be all I am. So for example, with Lumina Spark, they will talk of the everyday personality as different from the underlying personality. And that can be quite different. So that the persona is that one that people see, the one that I think Hogan calls it the reputation you have with people, which may be different from everything else that you are. It is part of it, but not everything that you are. And so the persona is what you believe is required. And oftentimes, so for example, the agentic leader, which many people expect, the person who takes charge, who does things and leads the charge from the front. If that is your expectation in coming into the role, or what has helped you be successful come into the role, the individual is likely to keep being that. And the risk is that, like I said earlier on, in an environment where you need to rely on empowering other people, if you keep on being as agentic as that without being communal, which could be the flip side of that, you might be the person standing in front, leading from the front. And there are many cultures in the world where the leader is the person at the back.
Yes, I think you're right. The person is not at the front. The model we're talking about being at the front is very much I think, a Western model about leading from the front, whereas in other cultures...
Which probably comes from the military. But if you look at a shepherd is at the back of his flock, keeping an eye on them. And when the sheep stray, they bring them back in. They're not at the front. And there are other examples when they look at horses. The horses that lead are not always the ones at the front.
If a leader, for example, is overusing maybe their strength, what could be the kind of consequences of their behaviors on individuals, teams, and cultures, in particular, if they're not aware of that they're overusing their strengths?
So let's take an example of a leader who's people-focused, who's predominantly people-focused, and wants to take care of the people and make sure their well-being is okay. And that becomes, if that becomes their focus, when there is a lot of stress and change around the team, they may lose sight of the reason for that change. They may become less outcome focused and therefore take care of the people to the detriment of what's the reason, what is it we need to be achieving here. Now, there are people who in that team will begin to feel alienated because they feel they're okay, they're independent enough not to need that much care. They want to achieve what needs to be achieved. They're more outcome focused. So that could very easily cause the reason for the team being together, what they're there to achieve, not to be achieved because that the focus has gone too much on one side. If you consider someone who is discipline driven, or some people will say conscientious, if you look at the dotting the I's and crossing the T's and making sure things are done properly, you might lose focus on the bigger picture. you might lose focus on the impact on the team, because you are now micromanaging. You're now making sure that everything is done, but people need to be delegated, to be respected, and therefore to bloom in their creativity.
Tell me how Hogan works in terms of maybe allowing an individual to recognize that, yeah, they got strengths, and at the same time, how can they use their strengths so that it doesn't become a liability as a tool for them?
So with that, and I believe, yes, Hogan does it, but the other instruments also point at it, that when we are stressed, like the example you're giving, when we are naturally good and prefer in our comfort zone with the intuitive thinking, the blue sky thinking, when we are stressed, when we are excited, when we are under pressure, we tend to rely on what we know. So let's say that is what happens to you. If you recognize that when you're stressed, that happens. But also, if you are a compassionate person who wants people to be well and do well, it's then behoven on you that when under stress, if you remind yourself that people need to be taken care of, that can temper your blue sky thinking in your own space. Because then you need to be reminded, what will the impact of your spending time in your office on the morale of the people you are working with, on knowing how they're feeling and what their challenges are. Because in many ways, your role as a leader is to service them, to enable them, create a space for them to succeed, because that is what then brings the team success and your own success. But if you retreat because of the stress and pressures into your comfortable cocoon, they get left out and you get out. So that with ourselves, there's always that other part. And Hogan does it because there are three different areas or measurements that it does. One of them looks at the bright side, we call it the dark side, and then your values. So oftentimes that in the places where we run the risk, because it's not certain that you will overextend or derail. It's just you have a high risk of doing it. And if you're aware that you have a high risk of, for example, being mischievous to a large extent, it then calls on you to, okay, what is it in your values, what's really important to you, that you can bring in mind and hold with you to temper that mischief. For example, if you're traditional in your beliefs, that can be a temper against the mischief, because there are certain things you would not do, because it would be outside the norm for you to behave like that. So if that mischievousness enables you to consider all the possibilities and not be afraid of failing if you took all of them, then being traditional, having traditional as one of your values could say, but the norms in society are, this needs to be done, that doesn't need to be done. I'm not sure if that's any clearer.
The question that popped into my mind is, how do you coach somebody? One of the words you were using earlier on, get someone, a leader, to recognize, to become aware. How do you get a leader to translate it from a framework of recognizing what their strength is to then catching themselves, not overusing it?
It depends on who the leader. Now, what you have with those assessments is data. This is data of how people perceive you. This is data, and that is drawn from what you say you are and how people perceive people who say they're like that. And if you have that data that says, if you are like this is how you are perceived, and if you keep doing this, if you keep speaking over people, people tend to keep quiet and leave you in your own space. Or people challenge you and they're now spending their energies fighting you rather than moving towards the goal. If you have that data, then as a coach, my question would be, is this of interest to you? What do you want to do about it? If you don't like it, if you like it, is it meeting your purposes? Both your short-term and your long-term purposes. So as a leader, it's giving them the data and encouraging them to look at it, own it, and then make decisions.
So it becomes a choice.
It is always a choice. It is, in my view, it is always a choice. Even when we think we don't have any choices, we have made a choice.
Yeah.
And and that's the way, because with coaching, the individual has to be bought into it. It's not something you can teach them. It's not teaching, it's not consulting. They make the realization, but the additional step then is, when you've made the realization, it sits in your head. Things change when your behavior changes. That's when learning really happens. So what are you going to do about it?
Let's turn the sort of turntables on you, Joseph. You have found yourself overusing a strength, even with the best intentions. What did that teach you?
You would have come across the Johari window.
Yes. Yeah.
The Johari window, which exposes, for me, it captures how there's parts of us that we know, and there's parts of us we do not know. And when I've caught myself being mischievous, for example, taking risks that I haven't thought through because the consequences really are not scary for me. When that has happened, I've realized often that, there was a blind spot I have, that this environment I thought I had control of, I don't have as much control of it. And the consequences of that can be minor or greater depending on what it is. So a few times I have been in environments where I haven't been taken very seriously because I actually didn't care that much what people thought. And in hindsight, I realized that actually it would have been useful if I was taken more seriously. And therefore, if I thought of that, I would have come in that place perhaps dressed differently, perhaps not spoken as quietly as I could have been, louder in asserting myself rather than observing people.
As we wrap this up, and in terms of using our strengths, what's the kind of key message do you want to leave with the listeners, Joseph?
The key message is that we need to know our strengths. We need to know them in order to use them. But in that, we also need to be aware that those strengths are the places where we are comfortable. And under stress, under pressure, when we are excited, a different part of our brain can take over so that we are not self-monitoring as much as we could, and therefore we run the risk of overusing those strengths because we are not self-monitoring as much. Our attention is elsewhere, so we can overuse those strengths. And as a leader, the impact on all the people is greater. The more people who rely on you, who look up to you, the more the risk of impact on them will be higher. So it's just an awareness that, yes, use our strengths, but still be aware that there is a risk overusing them, and figuring out what is it you're going to do to manage that overuse.
So I guess in a nutshell, what you're saying is every strength, when pushed too far, becomes a weakness in disguise, really. It becomes less effective in disguise and may not get you the outcome that you want.
Indeed. And sometimes it may not even be over pushed. It's used in the wrong, sometimes it's being used in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong person.
It makes me think about using extrovertedness in a context of maybe in a mindful situation. You don't want extrovertedness. Maybe you want somebody who has the energy is quieter as opposed to louder, in a sense. Would that be right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. If let's say an extroverted leader in a meeting where they have opinions that they need that they want to share. Now, and if you are chairing the meeting, you could very easily start and say what you want and what you think. And that would be your extroversion. You're thinking out there. Many of the people in the room might then take that you're giving them a lead as to where to go. By speaking first and forcefully, you have given a message that you do not want, even though that may not be your intention, that you do not, this is the direction of travel. And that may not be the right way to go. Mm. So I know that many good chairs will open up the discussion and allow the conversation to happen, hear where people are, and then voice.
Yeah.
It may not be appropriate in every meeting. And that's the thing about the timing of where do you use your strengths and where do you hold them back?
Yeah, I think in today's world, through the various instruments, whether it's the Hogan or the Luminous or the MBTI, these are tools for us to use for self-reflection and for look at how we can use them for our own and other people's benefit, as opposed to reinforcing this is what I'm good at.
Indeed.
Yeah. Thank you, Joseph. Thank you. Thank you very much for this illuminating subject around how leaders can use their strength in a wise and contextual way.
Thank you, Nita. Thanks for having me and wishing you all the best.
Thank you. If you're interested in working with me, connect with me on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, or www.nitasharma.com. And if you enjoyed the podcast, why not consider subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you have access to your podcast, and leave a review.